Heart to Heart, a Catholic media ministry, presents Good News Today, featuring an inspiring gospel teaching by Father Jim Willing.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Jesus said, "I am the good shepherd. A good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. A hired man who is not a shepherd and whose sheep are not his own sees a wolf coming and leaves the sheep and runs away. And the wolf catches and scatters them. This is because he works for pay and has no concern for the sheep. I am the good shepherd, and I know mine, and mine know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I will lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. These also I must lead, and they will hear my voice, and there will be one flock, one shepherd. This is why the Father loves me, because I lay down my life in order to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down on my own. I have power to lay it down, and power to take it up again. This command I have received from my Father." The Gospel of the Lord.
We hear in Isaiah chapter 40, like a shepherd, he feeds his flock and gathers the lambs in his arms, holding them carefully close to his heart, leading them home. Isn't that a tender and beautiful passage? We are probably most familiar with one of the favorite psalms that is ever known, Psalm 23. "The Lord is my shepherd, there is nothing I shall want." In the New Testament, there also are references to sheep and shepherd. Most famous probably is the parable Jesus tells of the lost lamb, and the shepherd who leaves the 99 on the hillside in search of that lost lamb, and when he finds it, places it on his shoulders in jubilation. Again, just such a beautiful image of the Lord's love for each one of us. So personal, so intimate. We hear again Jesus praying in great sadness over the people of Israel when he says, crying out from the depths of his heart, "They are like sheep without a shepherd." Sheep without a shepherd would be totally lost, not to mention maybe even famished. So it's not surprising that Jesus would call upon the great tradition of the Hebrew Scriptures, calling forth this image of shepherd. And even more, it would be understandable given that in the Palestinian setting, which was a very pastoral setting, where the shepherd figures very prominently as one of the main occupations of this rural people, that Jesus would call upon this tender image of shepherd to describe his tender and devoted love for his people. We hear then, the beginning of this gospel today, Jesus saying, "I am the good shepherd." And he then goes on to give what I would suggest are three descriptions of his shepherding love and care for his people. The first, he says, "I am the good shepherd." The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. John, in this particular gospel passage, devotes 4 of the 8 verses to this refrain, giving of one's life. This is the greatest sign of love. Greater love than this no one has, than he laid down his life for his friends. And it would not be uncommon to have heard of a Palestinian shepherd in those days who would die in the line of duty of guarding his sheep against the attack of wolves, or worse still, robbers who come to steal. And if they came across this shepherd, may even go to battle with him. Of course, it would be far beyond the call of duty, but nevertheless, it would not be uncommon for a shepherd to risk their life in defense of their flock. And certainly Jesus is highlighting this point to be the most important description of his love for his people, the willingness to sacrifice himself, which of course Jesus did. And this sacrificial love, that is the greatest sign of love, stands in stark contrast to other shepherds of his day, who were, in Jesus' words, hired hands. And I quote from the gospel, "The hired hand, who is no shepherd, catches sight of the wolf coming and runs away, leaving the sheep to be snatched and scattered by the wolf. That is because they work for pay. They have no concern for the sheep." Obviously, Jesus is describing a type of shepherd back then and there who considered little the sheep and more himself in the way he understood his occupation. And clearly, this is seen as an analogy for reflecting on the early Christian community, and it's a great sign to us in the church today, that today the flock of Christ continues to be under attack from both inside and outside. Inside, we suffer from poor pastors who are uncaring and unfaithful in their service to their people. You might know pastor is a Latin word for shepherd. And we have plenty of examples of pastors who I think are uncaring. And what I always notice, no matter how much we like to think, that the pastor alone doesn't make much of a difference, but what I observe is if you have a poor pastor, you usually have a struggling parish. Would that it wouldn't be that way, but that's what I observe. And how the church really suffers so much today as we see around us the church struggling because of poor pastors, poor priests, poor example of faithful and loving service. But that's not only how the church suffers. The church suffers today from outside forces that I also believe are attacking the church and hurting the people today. I think immediately of a recent example this week, but I won't name any names, of someone in the media who has directly attacked the church, I think in a most destructive, not a constructive way, in a most disrespectful and not in any kind of respectful dialogue. And I think this deeply hurts the church. It causes tremendous confusion and consternation in the people. And all I can think of is that, well, like the early Christian community that was under persecution, so today, to some degree, we are under attack most prominently in the media. And would that it were not, but I would point out, as I did earlier at Mass today, that this is how the early Christian community grew. When we're under persecution, somehow something inside of us is called to the front, a stronger faith, clearer witness, more accountability in our ministry. And I'd like to think that this will be the outgrowth of the difficult time that we're under now. The second characteristic of a good shepherd is that the good shepherd knows his sheep. Jesus said, "I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me." He says that 4 times in the 2 verses. To know, in the biblical sense, is to live in intimate communion with. And in fact, Shepherds back in the time of Christ lived with the flock. You can imagine a shepherd didn't have a day off. Where would the sheep go? He lived with his sheep day and night. So they came to know each other as well as we would know our own pet. And they share, sometimes, some people tell me they share their bed with their pet. I can't believe it. But, they seem to treat him as if they're one of the family. In fact, that's how a shepherd would have sometimes regarded the sheep. Almost as if they're one of the family. They would come to know him so intimately, so well, that they would oftentimes have a name for each individual lamb. And so the lamb would come to know the master's voice so well that when called, like a pet dog, they would respond to the master's voice. So this familiarity bred the most intimate relationship of shepherd to sheep. Jesus is drawing on this wonderful analogy to say, that's how I know my own, and my own know me. That's how he wanted his disciples and followers to come to know him intimately. It's the most beautiful part of the Lord's love for us, that we do not have this long-distance relationship, but we would feel so close to Jesus as to be one of his own, and that we would know everything about the Lord as the Lord truly knows everything about us. This truly is another powerful lesson for us who try to be about the nurturing profession. Even recently I was reading in the trouble that many of our communities are experiencing with crime, that one of the best ways that our police have learned to combat crime is by spending more time walking the beat in the community, so that as they allow themselves to get to know the people and the people to get to know them, it just fosters this greater sense of peace and order in that community. Isn't that interesting? So would that we learn this lesson of the Good Shepherd. Thirdly, finally, the point that Jesus highlights in this gospel passage of the Good Shepherd that characterizes his shepherding, nurturing care of his people is this sense of universality of the entire community. Now, this is the nature of God's love to be indiscriminatory. He says, I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. I must lead them too, and they shall hear my voice. We don't really know for sure who these other sheep are that are not of this fold, but one can only imagine that John the Evangelist is writing to his community to describe those other people who are not of their Christian community, particularly the Gentile people or the pagan people, whom the Lord also loves and obviously also laid down his life for them as well. Now, I would just point out that this is no small point to be made, because realize that Jesus is saying this to a predominantly, in fact, entirely Jewish audience. And remember, the Jewish people believed they were the chosen people. And that means everyone else is not. It was an exclusive club of God that they prided themselves in. I would suggest it's the hardest lesson for most human beings to unlearn is exclusivity. When one group considers itself to be a privileged class, it's very difficult to get them to share that privilege with others. And we see all kinds of examples of that, even amongst ourselves. Need I say that as Catholics, we once taught that we were the one and only true church in which people would find salvation, even though To be Catholic means to be universal. And so Jesus prays, there shall be one flock, then one shepherd. But notice the future tense. There shall be. And that's why I say this is Jesus almost praying as he prayed at the Last Supper, Lord, that they all may be one in us. That Jesus doesn't know difference, I don't think, from a Presbyterian or Baptist or Episcopalian, or all people are God's people, right? I was humored by a story. A friend of mine who works here as a tour guide at the cathedral told me she just last week was leading a Baptist group through the cathedral. And they were marveling about the beauty of our cathedral and sharing about our faith. And the tour guide was eager to share, I was once a Baptist. I have a great appreciation for your tradition, but I converted to Catholicism. And then one of the Baptists spoke up and said, I was once a Catholic. And it just goes to show we have a lot to share with each other. And what does it mean to be a convert? I would suggest the best meaning of the word convert is to become like Christ. And the only denominational name tag we would ever wear is that truly of a Christian. And the name tag is not what we say we are, but what our actions say we are. This is certainly the lesson that Jesus is wanting to share with his flock, as he calls us to not only be faithful sheep, but also shepherds ourselves, to ourselves and to one another. As I was reflecting and studying on this gospel, I couldn't help but ask myself the question, I wonder if Jesus came and stood before us today, and as often he would speak in parables and beautiful images, I wonder what image he would use today to describe the same kind of shepherding love and care for his people. What profession or career or person or symbol would you think he would draw on? I would propose this answer that I came to in my reflection. I believe Jesus today would speak about being a good parent. You might recall just a couple of weeks ago, I had the wonderful opportunity of making a retreat at Gethsemane. And during this time, I couldn't help but be inspired. First of all, it was just the beginning of spring, you might recall. And I couldn't help but to be inspired by seeing and walking among the woods and all of nature. The trees are budding and flowers are blossoming. I couldn't help but be inspired with this Easter season we're in. But that is not what inspired me most during the retreat. Naturally, I couldn't help but be inspired by the faithful and devoted monks. I felt as I joined them at prayer, as they would come to the chapel 7 times a day, beginning at 3 a.m., which I might add, I never joined them then. But 7 times a day they would come, and seeing these men who give up everything in their life to live a life of very strict penance and continual prayer, I couldn't help but be deeply inspired by them, but that is not who inspired me the most. The person that inspired me the most is this young mother who came one night to Compline, which was night prayer. She came carrying her infant child in her arms, couldn't have been more than just a few months old. And straggling behind was her terrible threesome little daughter. They proceeded to sit in front of me and entertain me completely. Of course, the beautiful infant was just a picture of comfort and security in her mother's arms. it touched me to just imagine myself trying to be as that child would be in the arms of our God, whom we could call Father, Mother, model parent. And even more so, this little 3-year-old who sat for 30 seconds in the pew and then began to explore, as she just had to do, first underneath the pews, crawling over people's feet, and then throwing something down the whole length of the pew, chasing it, bringing it back, and then deciding she'd go up and check the action up front, going into a different pew. And what always amazed me is that all the while this mother seemed to be praying. Of course, I don't know what she was praying. But every so often, it seemed to me she would open her eye and with the mighty index finger, completely in this remote control of her daughter, send her back. And she would whisper these secret instructions in her ear, which I wish I could just hear them. But her daughter would get the lesson and be still for another 30 seconds. And then on to, again, the exploration. And this went on and on and on. And what struck me is this great image of how God loves us and deals with us like a shepherd. His love is so tender on the one hand, but tough on the other hand. Certainly, it's the shepherding skill to discipline the sheep, just as a perfect parent would surely discipline their child, lest they run wild and nearly kill themselves and others. What struck me is that these, especially the 3-year-old, I was fascinated to see how she is just beginning to take on some of the features of her mother in her face. And to see, in some ways, we are truly made in the image and likeness of God. And yet that likeness needs to be built as our character is being built, to become even more like her mother, that we would become more like our God. And what struck me absolutely most is what a mother, a father sacrifices. I've heard so many stories over the years, and I think it is the closest to the gospel story I know of what parents endure and do for their children, giving up so much of themselves. For instance, I know someone who gives up their vacation so that they could send their children, provide their children with the best education, sending their children to good Catholic schools or universities. Of parents who serve their kids without ever mentioning how many diapers and dishes and laundry and meals, and forcing themselves to go to work that isn't such a pleasant experience, day after day, week after week, year after year. Talk about a shepherding care to provide the very best, leading them to green pastures, wanting for their child to have more than what they ever had. Isn't that the reflection of Jesus' love? And I think not only of parents, but of those who are parenting their own parents today, caring for their parent as they come in older age and parent becomes dependent on the child, and it's like the roles are reversed, huh? And they have the opportunity, as some share with me, to return the favor. And it just never ceases to inspire me. I really believe that parenting is a lot like shepherding. Yes, there are good parents and bad parents, like there are good shepherds and bad shepherds. But what we hear, unfortunately, are the exceptional cases. What we need to honor are the majority of people I see right before me today. You've taught me. You've shown me what it means to love. And when I sat in that chapel behind that mother, I knew this was the best meditation I had all week on God's love. And I'm not at all unlike that 3-year-old. And she is not at all like sheep, you know. It's the nature of sheep to be both stubborn and, on the other hand, timid and frightened. It's the nature of sheep to learn slowly and to follow the crowd. It's the nature of sheep to wander away, but then come back. And it's the nature of a child. And no matter how old we are, do we ever outgrow that? And yet God loves us just as we are. But like a perfect parent, He just loves us so much, He wants us to become our best. And so He's always wanting us to grow, to become more, to do better. That's a shepherd's love. This Sunday, I'm going to honor Parent Sunday. I know it isn't Mother's Day, it isn't Father's Day, but in my mind, it's where I discover the Lord's love best of all. And most importantly of all, if we are a child to that, then I think of how we need to allow ourselves to be loved by the Lord. I only wish to end with this thought, that could we allow God to be such a perfect parent to us and to teach us that greatest vocation in life to parent others.
Heart to Heart welcomes you back next week for another inspiring edition of Good News Today. If you are interested in other books, CDs, DVDs, or digital downloads by Father Jim or Father Michael, you can call toll-free 1-877-208-4875 or visit our website, www.heartoheart.org. There, you can also sign up to receive a weekly reminder to listen to these same programs online. And please, consider a donation of any size to help support Heart to Heart's radio and internet ministry. That's www.heartoheart.org or call 1-877-208-4875. Thank you for listening, and may God bless your heart and the hearts of all of your loved ones.
Heart to heart, hand in hand, praying for grace to understand. Spirit